The ground was already moving when I reached the edge of the ravine, and I knew I had less than 2 minutes before the whole shelf gave way. Below me, wedged between two slabs of black stone, a small shape was screaming, not crying, screaming, the way only something that has never once been afraid before can scream, because it has no memory of fear to compare this to. The sound cut through the wind, and the rising hiss of the flash flood, pouring down the channel a few hundred meters upstream, and every instinct in my body told me to step back from the edge and wait for someone stronger, someone better equipped, someone who was not me. There was no one else. 4 adult Cathrek paced the rim beside me, pacing in tight, furious circles, their long bodies low to the ground, their claws digging useless grooves into the rock. Fenrek, the pack's second in command, had already tried to climb down once. He had made it 4 meters before the wall crumbled under his weight, and he was forced to haul himself back up, his forepaws scraped raw. I watched him stand at the edge afterward, chest heaving, staring down at the cub he could not reach, and for the first time since I had arrived on this moon, I saw something in a Cathrek's eyes that looked almost like the human word helpless. I had spent 8 months studying this pack, watching them hunt, watching them raise their young, watching them look at me the way you might look at a small, soft animal that had wandered too far from its burrow. They called humans fragile hands, not as an insult, simply as a fact, the same way you might call water wet. Our skin tore easily, our bones broke easily. We had no claws, no fangs built for anything except chewing. By every rule of their world, we should not have survived long enough to build the research dome I called home. But claws were exactly the problem now. Cathrek claws were built to grip flesh, to hold prey still, to dig into muscle and bone. On wet, crumbling stone at a steep angle, those same claws found nothing to hold on to. Their weight was wrong for climbing. Their whole bodies had been shaped by evolution to be perfect hunters, and, in this one moment, on this one wall of loose black rock, that perfection was useless. My hands were not perfect. My hands were soft and small, and exactly the shape needed to flatten against a narrow ledge, to curl around an edge 2 centimeters wide, to adjust their grip in a fraction of a second, the way claws never could. I did not decide to go down. I simply found myself already moving, clipping a length of climbing rope to the anchor bolt I always carried in my field kit, checking the tension twice out of habit even as my hands shook. Fenrek said something to me in the low, rolling language of his people, a sound I had learned meant something close to wait, but I was already over the edge before the word finished leaving his throat. The rock face was worse than it looked from above. Loose stone shifted under my boots with every step, and twice I felt a ledge give way entirely beneath my foot before I found the next one. The flood upstream was growing louder, a deep, rolling hiss that vibrated through the stone itself, climbing toward us the way a tide climbs a beach, except this tide was made of liquid methane and cold enough to stop a human heart in under a minute. I did not think about the flood. I thought about my hands, and where they needed to go next, and the small shape below me that had stopped screaming and started making a quieter sound instead, a sound that scared me far more than the screaming had. 20 feet down, I found a crack wide enough to jam my fingers into, and I used it to swing myself sideways toward the ledge where the cub was wedged. He was smaller than I expected, barely the size of a large dog, his fur soaked through and matted with dust, his back legs caught between 2 slabs that ground against each other every time a fresh tremor rolled down from above. His eyes found mine, wide and black, and full of something that needed no translator to understand. I talked to him the whole time I worked, the way you might talk to any frightened animal, low and steady, even though I knew he could not understand a single word. I told him my name was Grace. I told him I had done stupid things before, and survived most of them. I told him to hold still, which he did not do, because he was 4 months old and terrified, and every time he thrashed the slabs around his legs, shifted another centimeter closer together. The rock beneath my own feet groaned, a long, low sound that I felt in my teeth before I heard it in my ears. I had perhaps 30 seconds before the ledge gave way entirely, and the cub was still trapped. I did the only thing I could think of. I wedged my shoulder into the gap beside him and pushed, using my whole body as a lever, feeling stone bite into my skin through my jacket, feeling something in my shoulder shift in a way that would hurt terribly later, but did not hurt at all in that moment, because there was no room left in my body for pain, only for the single narrow task of moving 2 slabs of rock apart by 4 inches. The gap opened. I grabbed the cub by the loose fur at the back of his neck, the way I had seen the adults carry their young, and hauled him against my chest, just as the ledge beneath us both gave way completely. I remember falling. I remember the rope going taut with a violence that knocked the air out of my lungs, and I remember rock sliding past me on every side, some of it catching my left arm, my side, the back of my head, each impact a separate bright shock that I would only be able to count and name much later, once the adrenaline had drained out of me and left the pain behind to collect its debt in full. What I remember most clearly, though, is that I did not let go of the cub, not once, not even when the world was tumbling and I no longer knew which direction was up. My arms had locked around him the way a person locks a door before a storm, without conscious thought, simply because some part of me had already decided, long before the rock slide began, that letting go was not a choice that existed anymore. The rope caught. That is the only reason I am able to tell this story at all. It caught on the anchor bolt 8 meters above, and it held, and the 2 of us swung out over open air, spinning slowly, dust and small stones still raining down around us, while 11 meters below, the flash flood finally reached the base of the ravine and turned the whole channel into a churning black river. I do not remember being pulled up. I am told it took the pack nearly 10 minutes, working in relay, taking turns hauling on the rope, because none of them had hands built for that kind of steady, controlled pulling. I am told Fenric refused to let anyone else take his place at the front of the line, even after the skin on his palms split open from the friction of the rope. I do not remember any of it. I remember opening my eyes on the rim of the ravine, rain and dust in my hair, the cub still clutched against my chest, and very much alive, making small, exhausted sounds into the fabric of my jacket. I remember Sartha's face above me, the pack's alpha, a creature who had spoken perhaps 40 words to me in 8 months, who had always watched me from a careful distance, the way you might watch an interesting but ultimately unimportant weather pattern. She was not watching me from a distance now. She was close enough that I could feel the warmth coming off her body, and her eyes, usually flat and calm, were wide in a way I had never seen before. I do not remember much of what happened after that. There was a stretch of white light and quiet voices at the research station, and then a longer stretch of pain that arrived all at once, as if it had been waiting patiently outside a door for its turn, and had finally been let in. My left side, from shoulder to hip, had taken the worst of the rock slide. The station medics did what they could, but the equipment on this moon had never been designed with human injuries in mind, and by the time I was stable enough to be properly examined, the damage had already begun to heal in its own way, leaving behind marks that no amount of later treatment could fully erase. I refused evacuation twice. Not out of bravery, though the station director seemed to think so at the time. I refused because I needed to know, with my own eyes, that the cub had survived. His name, I learned later, was Veko, and he had come through the fall with nothing worse than a sprained hind leg and a fear of loose stone that I was told would probably last his whole life. When they finally let him into the room where I was recovering, he pressed his head against my uninjured side and made a low sound that the station's translator software could not quite render into English, though I did not need it translated to understand what it meant. It took 3 weeks before I could stand without the brace they had built for me. 3 weeks of long, quiet days, spent mostly staring at the ceiling and turning the whole event over in my mind, trying to understand why I had done what I did, and failing to find an answer that felt complete. It was not bravery, not really. Bravery, as far as I understood the Catholic definition of the word, belonged to prey animals in their final moments, a useless flare of instinct that changed nothing about the outcome. What I had done was not that. I had not acted without thinking. I had thought about every single handhold, every shift of weight, every second I had left before the flood arrived. It had simply never occurred to me, not even for a moment, to calculate whether the cub was worth the risk before I started climbing. Fenric visited me twice during those 3 weeks, and both times, he asked me the same question in different ways, through the translator, his low voice carrying a confusion that seemed to run deeper than simple curiosity. "Why did you go down for him? He is not your kin. He is not even your species. What debt did you owe him?" I did not have a good answer the first time. By the second visit, I had thought about it enough to say something closer to the truth. I told him that where I came from, you did not need to owe someone a debt to help them. Sometimes you helped because you could, and because the alternative was watching something small and frightened die when you had the ability to stop it. I told him that calculating the cost afterward, rather than before, was not weakness. It was simply a different kind of strength than the one his people had built their whole society around. He left both times without responding, and I assumed the conversation had simply confused him past the point of continuing it. I did not know, until later, that he had been repeating our conversations to the rest of the pack almost word for word, and that Sartha herself had begun asking the same questions of the other Cathrek who had witnessed the rescue, turning the story over among the pack, the way you might turn over a strange object found on a beach, trying to understand what it was and where it had come from. 3 weeks and 2 days after the flood, I was finally able to stand on my own, outside the research dome, leaning on a cane the station medics had built for me out of scrap piping, when I saw the entire pack approaching across the open ground at dawn. I had never seen all 11 adults gathered in one place before, not even during the largest communal hunts. They moved together in a loose formation I did not recognize from any of my 8 months of field notes, slow and deliberate, and something about the shape of that formation made the hair on my arms rise before I understood what I was looking at. Sartha walked at the front. She stopped a few feet away from me and simply stood there for a long moment, studying my face, and then, slowly, her gaze moved down to the scars along my left arm, the ones that ran from my shoulder almost to my elbow in a pattern that still looked raw and pink against my skin. She reached out one claw, the longest on her right forepaw, and drew it along the length of the largest scar without breaking the skin, tracing the shape of it the way you might trace a line on a map. I stood perfectly still and let her, though every instinct in my body screamed at me to pull away. Then she threw her head back and made a sound I had never heard from her before, a long, rising call that the rest of the pack answered in unison, all 11 voices overlapping into something that was not quite a howl and not quite a song, something that shook the loose gravel at my feet and rolled out across the open plain toward the ravine where all of this had begun. My translator caught perhaps 60% of what followed, the software struggling with words and grammar structures it had never been asked to render before. But the meaning came through clearly enough, filled in by context, and by the way every one of the 11 Cathrek present had lowered their bodies slightly, a posture I recognized from their own rituals as a sign of respect shown only to pack leaders and to the memory of the dead. Among the Cathrek, I learned that morning, a scar earned while protecting the pack was never considered a wound. It was considered a record, a piece of testimony written into the body itself, in a place where it could never be argued with or taken back. It said, without needing translation into any language, that a price had been paid for someone else's survival, and that the price had been paid before any question was asked about what it might cost. They did not have medals where Sartha came from. They did not have ceremonies with ribbons or written citations. They had this instead, a single claw drawn along an old scar, and 11 voices raised together at dawn. Sartha spoke again, and this time the translator rendered the phrase clearly enough that I did not need to guess at its meaning. Claw that chose. That was the name she gave me, standing there on the open plain with my cane in one hand and the wind pulling at my hair. I was told afterward, by the station's cultural liaison, that the title had never once, in the entire recorded history of the Cathrek people, been given to anyone who was not born into the pack. I did not know what to say. I am not sure any words would have been enough, in English or in their language, to answer what had just been offered to me. So I said nothing at all, and simply stood there, while the pack settled around me in a loose circle, closer than I had ever been allowed to stand to more than 1 or 2 of them at a time. And for the first time since I had arrived on that moon, I did not feel like a visitor being studied from a careful distance. I felt like I belonged exactly where I was standing. Veko found his way to the front of the circle a few minutes later, limping slightly on his still healing leg, and pressed his head against my side, the same way he had in the recovery room 3 weeks earlier. This time, Sartha did not pull him back or correct him. She simply watched, and something in the set of her shoulders looked, as close as I could tell with a species whose expressions I was still learning to read, almost like pride. I think about that morning often now, especially on the cold nights when the scars along my arm ache in a way the medics tell me may never fully go away. I came to this moon to study a species that saw humans as fragile, soft, unsuited to a world built for hunters. I did not come here expecting to prove them wrong, and I am not sure, even now, that proving them wrong was really what happened. I think, instead, that I taught them a new way to measure strength, one that had nothing to do with claws or speed, or the size of a creature's teeth. My hands were soft enough to find a grip that Fenric's claws never could. My body was fragile enough that when it broke, it left a permanent record behind, one that could be read and understood by a species that had never before had a reason to believe a fragile hand could reach farther than a claw. They were right about me, in a way. My hands are soft, my skin tears easily. I will carry the marks of that rock slide for the rest of my life, and there will be mornings when the ache in my shoulder reminds me exactly how close I came to not walking away from that ravine at all. But softness and fragility, I have learned, were never the opposite of strength. They were simply a different shape of it, one that happened to fit into a gap that nothing else on that moon could reach. It took a flash flood, a frightened cub, and one very stubborn decision made in under 30 seconds for an entire pack of apex predators to understand that. And it took the same event for me to finally understand it about myself. I still catch Sartha looking at my scars sometimes, when she thinks I am not paying attention, and each time she does, I remember that single claw tracing a careful line along my arm at dawn, and the sound of 11 voices rising together across an open plain, and I think that whatever I lost on that rock face, I gained something in its place that I would not trade back for anything, not even for skin without a single mark on it.